Penguin Random House Canada presents Other Worlds, Stories by Alexis. Read by Alexis and Yanna Mcintosh. To Elizabeth Jane Riddell. We understand nothing about God's works if we do not take it as principle that he wished to blind some and enlighten others. Blaise Pascal, Pensée. Translated from the French by Alexis. Contrition, an isekai. In Memoriam, Charles Officer. 1. Tam Modeste. In 1857, Trinidad was green and mountainous, held in the blue palm of the ocean, the skies above it as blue as the sea, but for the clouds, those wisps of white and gray hurried along by ocean winds. At that time, the British were largely avoidable. One could live in the forests, say, or on the outskirts of villages, if one knew how. And this Tamana Modeste did know. He had lived all his life on the edge of a Carib village that had no name, not far from the ocean, the wide sea expanding before him as he ventured up a mountainside, looking for the plants and minerals he needed for his trade. Magic. Tam Modeste, a Carib from generations of Carib Indians, a Buyès from generations of Buyès, was naturally wary of the British. Born in 1788, he and his family had lived through the savagery of Thomas Picton's reign, the torture and murder of anyone who so much as knew about Obeah or magic. Picton had unintentionally driven the Modeste deeper inland, and this was something for which Tam was grateful, but his mistrust of the British had hardened into something like superstition. And although he had encountered very few Britons in his life, only 2 in fact, British was the name of a wall beyond which his curiosity did not venture. This wall, however, was not static. It moved, it was alive, always coming his way, he felt. So, studiously avoiding places where Britons might congregate, Tam had explored, perhaps more fully than any of the Modestes before him, the interior of the land where he was born. He knew its hills, groves, grasses, rivers, and minerals, and stones, as well as he knew himself. He knew the kobos, mapipis, toads, howler monkeys, tattoos, iguanas, congarees, and bachak, as well as he knew his own family. If it can be said of sorcerers in general that their familiars, the animals who accompany them and help them in their tasks, are expressions of themselves, aspects of a sorcerer's being on earth, it can be said of Tam that the entire south of Chalebe, the Carib name for Trinidad and thus his name for it, was as alive to him and his desires as a black cat or white dog might be to a witch. He was a man who chose solitude, one who was at home in the bush through hurricanes, blinding storms, and lightless nights. He was private and hard to find, and yet at times he was desperately sought by those who needed the succor that comes of Obeah: curses, spells, tonics, potions, and powders. Being as great a Buyès as he was, it was inevitable that Tam should be spoken of and gossiped about, that knowledge of his whereabouts was precious, and that there was speculation about what he could actually do. It was said of him, for instance, that he could command the winds and rains. This was an exaggeration. Tam was, rather, so sensitive to the state of the land that he could predict where and when it would rain, where and when it would not. It was said of him that he could speak with all manner of creatures, birds in particular, so that if, say, someone had lost an important thing, however small, Tam could call on the animals to find it. This was, in essence, true. He could not so much speak to animals as he could reach the place in himself where his will and the will of the creatures around him congregated, speaking through the intercession of the land itself, communicating as beings who shared a womb might communicate. It was in this way that he tamed the various snakes that lived near his hut, including a mapipi balsane, a 7-foot-long viper who watched over his property at night, and whom Tam called Coco. It was said, finally, that although he was even-tempered, he had caused a number of deaths. The deaths had come when men, jealous of his knowledge, had tried to force him to do their bidding with threats of violence. Most of these men were victims of snakebite, but at least 2 had been eaten alive by Bachak. Their corpses and remains had been found far from Tam's hut, but it was known that, if you could find Tam, it was unwise to vex him. These stories were true. Coco had bitten 6 men who'd approached the hut at night. Whatever their business may have been, they were bitten by the viper and 5 of them died. About these deaths, Tam was not unhappy. As to the Bachak, those tiny, tough fire ants, they had been sent by Tam as warning to a man who'd threatened him. The Bachak had flooded the man's hut in such number that they were like a reddish tide, madly biting all the beings they touched. The one who'd threatened Tam survived, but his wife and child did not. And though the man never dared to approach Tam again, the death of his family was one of 2 profound regrets in Tam's life. For all his wariness and willingness to punish those who threatened him, however, Tam was routinely capable of great kindness. When a woman came to him wishing to know if her husband was faithful, he would do this for a handful of chenet, if the woman was poor, for a kingfish, if she were wealthy. More, if the husband proved unfaithful, Tam would provide at no cost an undetectable herbal extraction that was guaranteed to keep the man impotent for months. If a man came asking for the means to keep his family fed, Tam would draw him a map of the vicinity, one that showed where coins, gold rings, or false teeth had been lost in the brush, or stolen for nests. If rats or manikou overran a field or grove, he would see to it that the animals left enough for the men and women who depended on the crops, entering the overrun field and drawing a wide circle around viable plants, a circle respected by rats, manikou, birds, and ants. This last spell was done freely when done for those in the settlement near his hut. The Caribs there were his kin, if not his family. It was they who spoke his language, Garifuna, and thus they who lived in his world as he did in theirs. It was they who shared their milk, maize, and rice. It was they who understood his humor and his complaints. It was they who treated him best, believing that his art, not his person, was holy, visiting him only when they were in serious need, waiting patiently when he was away from his hut, as he often was, gathering the things he needed for his spells. But those who knew Tam found it difficult to keep their admiration for him to themselves. They shared stories about the mapipi who kept watch over him, about the clouds that did his bidding, about his ability to find missing teeth, lost shillings, gold rings. And these stories spread from the south of the island to the north, where, of course, they were heard by the people from elsewhere, the British. Being civilized, that is, believing that their own superstitions were better founded than those of the natives, none of the Britons believed the stories they heard. But a shaman is a shaman, and by nature a threat to authority. So Captain James Edward Fernby was sent south with 2 men, not to discover magic, but rather, as his commander, Major Bennet, put it, to take the temperature of the natives living there. Captain Fernby was, even in the eyes of his own men, obnoxious. He was born to wealth and privilege, and, having little talent himself, took relentless advantage of his good fortune. He was self-absorbed, willfully ignorant, and careless of the safety of those in his charge.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?